Well, thank you to everyone for zooming in this evening for this momentous panel discussion. Thanks particularly to the Evanston Public Library and to Lorena Neal in particular for their partnership going back several years now with Northwestern on this series of forums that are designed to engage the general public in conversations about the core issues facing us as citizens of the world. We are honored to be presenting this evening's program in partnership once again with the Evanston Public Library. So, and I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but I just want to say a few words first about what this program this evening, what this panel discussion is about and why we organized it. We all know that there are multiple dimensions to this current election crisis, or you might say there are multiple election crises all converging together. On the one hand, you have the worst pandemic in a century, which happens to be spiking in the United States at this very moment. We just had the worst single week in COVID cases. We have an ongoing battle over voter suppression tactics, a war on mail-in ballots. We have a massive crisis of voter intimidation and electoral violence. A report from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project and Militia Watch says that 5 states are at high risk for activity by armed groups. Those states being Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Oregon. 4 of them are swing states. Electoral violence is already going on. We've seen cases around the country of armed groups intimidating voters at polling sites. We saw over the weekend the Texas highway incident with the Biden campaign bus. And these are not just spectacles. That campaign events have been canceled. The Biden campaign is making decisions about where and when to hold events on the basis of these violent, intimidating incidents. A Michigan judge just struck down a ban on open carry of guns at polling places on election day. And for the first time in its 25-year history, the International Crisis Group, an organization that analyzes civil wars and conflicts around the world, has turned its attention to the domestic front within the US, issuing a very bracing report on the looming risk of electoral violence, stating the 2020 US presidential election presents risks not seen in recent history. Add to that the massive disinformation campaign and conspiracy theories that have been circulating particularly over the last 4 years. And recently there have been reports of a massive flood of disinformation in Spanish targeting Latino communities in swing states. There's a debate over the very legitimacy of the election with doubts about mail-in ballots. You have the recent news of the TrickBot ransomware attack on dozens of hospitals in the Northwest, with malware gangs wreaking havoc on the US healthcare system. Clint Watts of the Foreign Policy Research Institute put it this way: we've got COVID-19 and the election at the same time, battleground states, voter suppression. When you bring all of these together, there's a powder keg in cyberspace. And in addition to all of those factors, you have a president who is implicated in each and every one of them. Not only badly mishandling the pandemic response, but acting as a super spreader at the White House and now holding mass campaign rallies around the country in direct defiance of medical advice from public health officials and his own advisors. Voter suppression, of course, has a long and ugly history in America, but as Politico magazine recently reported, never before in modern presidential politics has a candidate been so reliant on wide-scale efforts to depress the vote as Trump. And let me emphasize, this was a reported piece in Politico, not an op-ed, not an opinion essay, a reported piece that reported never before in modern presidential politics has a candidate been so reliant on wide-scale efforts to depress the vote as Trump. Trump has also been implicated in the voter intimidation and electoral violence problem, telling the Proud Boys to stand by, encouraging an army of his supporters to monitor polling sites, tweeting the video of the highway incident in Texas with adding the line, "I love Texas." We have an endless and well-documented stream of lies. This is the most mendacious president in history. We have his own contribution to a culture of conspiracism, alternative facts, and post-truth. And so you have this multiple multi-dimensional election crisis in the making, as the title of tonight's panel puts it. And we have really an all-star dream team panel to untangle this web and help us make sense of it. I will briefly introduce the speakers and then we're going to have a conversation. June Cross is a writer, filmmaker, and professor of journalism at the Columbia Journalism School, where she directs the documentary journalism program. She's the director of the timely new PBS Frontline documentary, Whose Vote Counts, which investigates voter suppression and the 2020 presidential election. She's been a producer for Frontline and CBS News. She covered the 1980 and 1984 presidential campaigns for the PBS NewsHour. Her autobiographical film, Secret Daughter, which examined how race and color impacted her family, won an Emmy and a duPont-Columbia Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. Rachel Beatty Riedl will be familiar to those of us in the Northwestern community because she was at Northwestern for several years, but recently left us to become the director of the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University, where she's also John S. Knight Professor of International Studies and a professor in the Department of Government. She's the author of Authoritarian Origins of Democratic Party Systems in Africa and co-author of From Pews to Politics, Religious Sermons and Political Participation in Africa. She chairs the Comparative Democratization section of the American Political Science Association, and she co-hosts Ufahamu Africa, a podcast about African politics. As I mentioned, she used to be at Northwestern, where she taught political science and also directed the program of African Studies. And I had the pleasure of working with her in that role. Thrilled that she can be back in virtually with us at Northwestern tonight. Maria Stefan is the co-author with Erica Chenoweth of the mega influential book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, which was published in 2012 and awarded the Graumeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. She's also the co-author of Bolstering Democracy, Lessons Learned and the Path Forward, and co-editor of Is Authoritarianism Staging a Comeback, presciently published in 2015. Interesting to revisit that question in light of the last 5 years. Maria served in the US State Department from 2009 to 2014, where she worked on Afghanistan and Syria. She co-directed the Atlantic Council's Future of Authoritarianism initiative, and she was research director at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. Jeffrey Isaac is the James H. Rudy Professor of Political Science at Indiana University. He is the author of the list titled Against Trump, Notes from Year One, Democracy in Dark Times, and Arendt, Camus, and Modern Rebellion. He's former editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Politics, a flagship journal of the American Political Science Association. He writes a column for Public Seminar and is a co-convener of the Democracy Seminar, a forum initiated by the New School in New York for activists and thinkers around the world who support democracy against the looming global threats of authoritarianism. In March, he drafted and circulated a much-discussed open letter from political scientists titled, "We must urgently work to guarantee free and fair democratic elections in November." So he's been on this specific issue for a while. And last but not least, Daniel Schneiderman is head of advocacy and research for the US office of the International Crisis Group, an independent organization that I mentioned earlier, which sounds the alarm to prevent deadly conflict around the world. Daniel worked on the White House's National Security Council as the director for Yemen under Presidents Obama and Trump, interestingly. He also spent 2.5 years working on the State Department's Syria desk and an assignment to the Joint Chiefs of Staff's Directorate of Strategy, Policy, and Operations. Daniel worked extensively on the aforementioned International Crisis Group's new report, the US presidential election, managing the risks of violence. And that is exactly where I'd like to begin. The International Crisis Group is an organization that's headquartered in Brussels. You head up or work in the Washington office, but it's a global organization with a focus on civil wars and conflict zones. But for the first time in its 25-year history, the ICG has now turned its attention to the domestic front within the US, issuing this very stark report on the looming risk of violence around the 2020 election. So as someone who worked extensively on the report, can you tell us a little bit about its key findings and what occasioned this departure for your organization to focus on the US?
Sure. Thanks, Danny, and thanks to my other panelists. It's a privilege to be here this evening to talk about a topic that's as important as and timely as this one. I'd also like to say a shout out to the Highland Park, Illinois branch of the family that's joined this evening, the Mevis Tepper clan. We're very pleased that they could be here this evening. So why don't I just start with our principal findings of our recent report that Danny mentioned, and the way that we like to lay out our reports to give you a quick bite at the top are 3 important questions. The first is what's new, the second is why does it matter, and the third is what should be done. I think, look, what's new here, right? The most important thing I can say on this score is that all of the ingredients are present for significant potential unrest around the election. Just a couple to highlight that, Danny, you mentioned in your opening remarks. There's significant and growing, frankly, polarization of the political polls in the United States. I think there's a significant set of stakes for this election, and both sides of the aisle have been not shy in their messaging around the election to highlight that. Both sides have talked about this as a potential make or break for the current iteration of the United States. Then the second question, I think, and we can get into any of the other number of sort of risk factors that exist and why I think they're important through the course of the discussion. And then I think the second question, why does it matter? Look, beyond the implications for Americans who are caught up in unrest or violence around the election, it's really a harbinger of whether institutions in the United States can guide the country safely through a period of drastic social political change. And if not, the United States, which is arguably still the world's most powerful country, could face a real period of growing instability and increasingly diminished credibility abroad. And there's also, I think, big implications for the global system and what it could mean for instability and how great powers approach dealing with the international system at large, which I'm sure we can get into in the discussion, right? The third question, what should be done, right? And this is really the sort of crux and the meat of the report. And I have to say, something that we at Crisis Group focus on is not just having sort of pithy analysis or doing deep research, but really trying to propose credible solutions to the crisis or the moment that we find ourselves in. And I think, look, we have to be very clear, right? There are certain things that are very important that have to be done. Authorities must be ready to counter violent intimidation and voter intimidation tactics and be prepared to continue polling in the event of any kinds of disruptions, right? And I'm sure we'll talk about all of the different kinds of disruptions that are potentially possible. I can think of a number of scenarios off the top of my head, one being, like you mentioned, Danny, in Michigan, open carry, folks showing up with guns at polling sites, people feeling deterred from going to the polls, or people who have different political views getting into an argument inside the poll. There's a shooting, the polling place is shut down for a period of time, becomes a crime scene. You can imagine that disrupting voting in a place like that and how our authorities prepare to respond to that, right? So that's one example amongst many that I'm sure we'll talk about, right? Then really, it's really very important that domestic political leaders at every level of government be prepared to make bipartisan calls for a clean election. And the best example that I have of this is the recent call by the two competitors for governor in Utah, who put out a joint statement video sort of calling for a respect for the process and committing to a peaceful transfer of power and to respect the results of the democratic election, right? I mean, it's sort of amazing in and of itself that that is something that has to be vocalized in the United States in this current moment, but it does and it needs to be, right? And so last, I think the sort of last point that I'll leave it on, it's really, I think, for us important that foreign leaders press U.S. counterparts to respect democratic norms and not declare winners prematurely, right? So this is something where you could see foreign powers either intentionally or unintentionally try to put a finger on the scale in a time where things are uncertain, and that contributes to what I have said in a number of different contexts is a very dry field where there's a lot of tinder that could potentially light a match to significant unrest. But this is one of those areas where foreign leaders in particular can be very careful. And I think the last point I'd like to leave as my initial set of opening remarks for the panel, I think we by no means see widespread violence in the United States as inevitable, right? Like I said, all of the conditions are there, and we're in a very troubling potential moments, but widespread violence is not inevitable. It's not for sure, but it's important that people be aware of the potential risks of the moment, which is part of what drove us to write the report. So why don't I leave it there?
Thanks, Dan. Before I move on to my next question, would any of our co-panelists like to respond to what Dan has just said about the International Crisis Group report? Jeff Isaac.
Sure. Thanks to everyone who's participating in this. I guess I wanted to praise Dan and his report, and also just note, so Danny, when he introduced me, mentioned that back in March, I drafted and circulated a letter that was actually signed by over 1,000 U.S. political scientists. I did this with my friend and colleague, Will Weinkoff. The letter was an open letter calling for there to be special attention paid to the security of this election given the pandemic. And basically what we advocated for was a set of changes that were being proposed by the Brennan Center. And the Brennan Center has been very active in this. This is back in March. So basically back in March, the Brennan Center and lots of electoral law experts and lots of political scientists and lots of good people were saying we need to do these things in order to secure the election. Very few of these things were done. And I forget when the crisis report came out, but it wasn't that long ago. When was it, Daniel Schneiderman, that your report actually came out?
It really was just about a week ago now.
Okay. So I guess the point I want to make is that all of us who are commenting in this are commenting on a kind of like constantly evolving situation in which lots of warnings are not being taken seriously by a lot of the people that we hope or wish would take them seriously. And, even this conversation, by tomorrow night, things can change. But I think the real point I want to make here is to credit that International Conference Group report and so many of the reports. In fact, there's an extraordinary literature that's been produced in the past 6 to 8 months about every dimension of this. It's fascinating. The number of NGOs that have been working on this problem, the number of scholars, teachers, the number of classes that are being taught, it's extraordinary. Will it all contribute to a democratic outcome? We will see. That's my comment, Danny.
I appreciate that. And I have more, there will be more opportunities for you to elaborate on some of those points in more detail. Maria or Rachel or June, would you like to add anything to that? I was sort of wondering, Maria, what you were thinking as someone who has both worked in government and is an expert on political violence in different parts of the world, as well as civil resistance. Do you have any thoughts on the International Crisis Group report and the disturbing issues it raises?
Yeah, well, the report is certainly sobering, and it does reinforce what a number of, analysts, scholars, and the like have been worrying about for a long time. Just to reiterate Jeff's last point, will it matter what's going to happen? And I think this is where it's so important what Dan said, that no outcome is inevitable. what people actually do and how they organize and the actions they take or refrain from taking will matter, and what leaders say and do matter. So I think there's a huge opportunity, notwithstanding all of the risks, for people to face the challenge. And there are lots of ways that people in communities are already responding to try to prevent, limit, mitigate violence, and to prepare people for alternative courses of action in the event that we have a contested election. So agency matters, and what people actually do is going to determine what we see, roll out in this country.
Is there a sense in which we already have a contested election? Are we beyond the point of saying if there's a contested election, in the sense that Trump has already indicated, although now he's sort of equivocating about it, but Axios reported that Trump is prepared, is planning to simply declare himself the winner if he's ahead tomorrow night, and then just and kind of stake that claim and put everyone else on the defensive and make the country respond. Isn't that sense, aren't we already, for that and about 50 other reasons, aren't we already in contested election territory here?
I'm going to jump in to Scott. I mean, I think this is a president who says a lot of things, and he doesn't always mean what he says, and a lot of it is just for the sake of rolling up his base. So I'm not sure that, I sort of reached a point where I take everything he says with a grain of salt. I'm watching more what's actually happening. I think there's going to be a lot of lawyering around the election. I think what he will do is have his team on the ground. If Pennsylvania, say, ends up being a very close state, there'll be a lot of lawyering going on to try to swing it. But I don't know. I think he does a lot of stuff that he doesn't follow through on. Maybe I'm being an optimist in this, maybe unnecessarily so. But generally, I feel like he hasn't yet. Not that he hasn't yet said the most outrageous things. He's continually saying the most outrageous things, but he hasn't always followed through on the most outrageous things. And when he gets called on it, he backs off. It's almost like he's a wannabe gang member, and he doesn't quite know how to be the strong man. He wants to be the strong man, but he's sort of acting like he thinks a strong man ought to act, but he doesn't really know how to be a strong man, because he doesn't have that experience. So I also want to throw a note of caution that to the degree that the media hypes this idea of violence, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I've been wary of that the last 4 or 5 days. Even last month while I was working on my documentary, when I first began to hear these things, there were a number of groups in the United States that were running scenarios, sort of like war game scenarios around different ideas of the elections. And one of them did have a violent outcome, but then there were like three other possible outcomes. So, I want to not focus on like violence is the only way this can go south. There are a whole lot of other ways that it can go south that don't involve the Proud Boys getting on buses and attacking people.
Right, which really underscores what I think what both Dan and Maria said, that there's nothing inevitable about this, that human subjectivity and will and choices that people make will have a lot to do with the outcome.
So
I
think Rachel wanted to jump in
on the idea about this already being a contested election. And I think it is, in the sense that when we look at elections across the world, right, to take a comparative perspective and what's happening in the United States right now, the idea that people's ability to cast votes and have those votes translated into elected office, right, who will hold power, the degree of doubt around that actually being the process is one that makes it a contested election, right? It's very concerning in that sense. And I think that when we look at the fact that this election is about whether or not democratic processes will determine who holds power, it makes it a different type of election. It's not one about policy differences, to my mind. It's not about tax policy, immigration policy. It's about whether or not our system will be able to maintain as a democracy. It's about the maintenance of political rights in terms of election participation. And so in that way, I think there are a couple of key factors to Maria's point about having agency and places to look, right? The degree to which citizens can use peaceful protest and contest the elections, contest any kind of early calling of election results or who will claim their victory, I think is really critical. And I think there are other places to look and put pressure as well. There are absolutely going to be court cases, right? We know this is going to be about a legal battle, but it's also a legal battle that will involve the actions and the decisions of hundreds of local and state officials, right? Because when we look at other places, the focus is so often on the role of the Electoral Commission and how it's organized, how it's independent, the calls that it makes. In the US federal system, this is all decentralized into state decisions, right, and processes. And so the ways in which state agents and officials are making these calls about what gets counted is concerning. It's decentralized, and it's going to kind of just proliferate the number of challenges we'll be facing. And so that will cause the election results to take time. And so citizens, the media, and the coercive forces of the state, the military and the police, all have a huge responsibility to claim democratic rights and the political process to make sure that votes translate into the right outcome in terms of representing the will of the people.
Yeah, on that point, Chris Hayes of MSNBC the other day, I think it was Sunday night, said he characterized Trump's closing strategy as suppress, intimidate, litigate. And on the suppress piece, I'd really like to drill down a little bit with you, June, because you've just done a really remarkable documentary film about this very issue. And it couldn't be timelier, because the other day the US Supreme Court rejected a lower court order that called for mail-in ballots in Wisconsin to be counted up to 6 days after Election Day, meaning that any ballots not received by Election Day will not be counted. Now, this is a decision shrouded in controversy, and it could mean any number of things. But as I mentioned, you just happened to have directed this very timely documentary film on this precise issue that aired, I think it was 2 weeks ago tomorrow night, on Frontline, on the PBS program Frontline. The documentary is called Whose Vote Counts. For those of you who didn't catch it when it aired on PBS, I strongly encourage you can watch it for free on the Frontline website. So June, can you help us make sense of these sorts of battles in Wisconsin and elsewhere, because there are many going on around the country, and give us the larger story, or the sort of historical, structural backdrop against which we should understand this election crisis. And there's this particular moment in the documentary that really struck me. It's really salient, where a community organizer in Milwaukee, Melanie McCurtis, says, "We're in 2020, but it feels like 1867. And this is a point that Colbert King recently made in the Washington Post in his article. When it comes to suppression of Black votes, it's the 19th century all over again. It brought really to mind Faulkner's line, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." So basically, June, give us a picture of what voter suppression looks like as this historical trajectory that you trace out in the film, and why it matters at this very moment.
Wow. Well, it actually goes back even before 1867. One of the big aha moments for me was discovering that there is actually no right to vote enshrined in the Constitution. So the battle to broaden the franchise has been one that's been constant ever since 1776. At that point, only the founders of the United States and those who had property, basically propertied white men, were allowed to vote. The rest of white men did not get the franchise until 50 years later, around 1728. Black men got the right to vote after, thanks to the 15th Amendment in 1867. Took another 50 years before women got the vote in the 1920s. And now, then another 50 years before the laws that had been passed in the 19th century had to be reinforced with the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act led to youth, immigrants, and people of color all being sort of awarded the franchise, not just awarded it, but like if you do anything, if any state decides to make any kind of change to their election laws, you have to go to the federal government and get permission before you can change those laws. It originally applied to the 7 states, six and a half states, most of North Carolina, 6.5 states of the former Confederacy. But by 2013, it actually applied to 19 states, including states like New York, Alaska, North Dakota, California. So there were places throughout the United States, pockets of places where people had to where jurisdictions had to apply for permission before they could change their election laws. In 2013, there was a challenge to the Voting Rights Act that is known as the Shelby County case, Shelby County versus Holder. And the formula by which it was decided who would be subject to federal jurisdiction was gutted by the Supreme Court. It said there was, it's 55 years now, we don't need this anymore. So the South was basically lifted. And those that we talked to in the film said that it wasn't just, it was a small technicality in the Voting Rights Act, but it sent a much larger signal, which was that, hey, you can go at voting laws around the country and we won't do anything about it. So basically, since 2013, the last 7 years, which also are a period of growing Republican power in the United States, we've seen changes to election laws, who can register to vote, how you can register to vote, what you need to do in order to show up to vote. Over the last 7 years, it's all gotten more and more difficult. And we've seen things like voting change it. You have to have a photo ID. They have been more aggressive about purging the rolls, cleaning the rolls. If you don't show up to vote for 2 elections, you can be removed and you have to re-register all over again. They have residency requirements. They have been closing polling places. There's a number of things that we've seen going on really in action since 2013. It coincides with with the growth and ascendancy of the Republicans in political power. And so now we find ourselves in 2020 in a situation where the Republicans actually hold most of the levers of power. So remember back in school, we learned about those checks and balances. There's like the federal, the executive, and the judiciary branch, legislative, judicial, and executive branches. And the Republicans hold the keys to most of those, to like all 3 of those at the moment in many of the states. So we're in a situation where the Republicans have been really using voting laws as a way to maintain, as much as a way to maintain power, as a way, and sort of doing it under the banner of we're trying to maintain election security.
And to stop this this obsession with voter fraud, quote unquote, which every serious study that's been done has concluded is essentially non-existent, or it exists at such a trivial
if you took all
level.
the cases out of the bill, even the Heritage Foundation, which maintains this, maintains a website that they call it sampling, but if you look at all the instances, we did, USA Today Network did a examination of this, and basically it comes out to 0.0025% of all the votes cast over the last 10 years were fraudulent. So, and the idea of somebody impersonating another voter is like practically non-existent if you look at that. And even if you look at absentee ballots, it's also a very small fraction. So we're basically using a hammer to go after a fly.
And yet there's an obsession in right-wing media and in conservative circles. There's an absolute obsession with this basically spectral issue, right? And so what I want to ask you, June, to just follow up on this is, it's one thing to point out the facts. It's 0.0025%. The facts are out there. It's really more about narrative. And so my question for you is, what's the specifically racial dimension of issue of massive voter suppression that goes back well over a century and a half?
Well, I mean, you know, it took the 15th Amendment to get in 1867 to get Black men the vote. And beginning in 1905, there are challenges to the 15th Amendment, legal challenges that go to the Supreme Court. And the courts have actually never been on the side of voting rights in this country. It has taken grassroots action from the people of the United States and legislative action in the Congress. So yes, it has generally been against African-American votes, Latinx voters. It still is, actually, if you look at much of the visual things, the pictures that accompany the stories about voter fraud, they very often picture either Black people or Latinx people. You know, even very recently, this thing that James O'Keefe's group, Veritas, did with Ilhan Omar, that was, you know, demonstrably the guy said he was paid to say what he said on the tape. You know, it's all brown people. So obviously, if brown people get the vote, there's somehow going to be voting fraud involved. And this is a very, very old trope.
And it has to be stopped. Do any of our panelists?
Well, it's going beyond just brown people now. You know, now because of COVID, we now have elderly people, disabled people. I mean, Black and brown people have become the canary in the coal mine. And we now have voting, you know, it is now aimed at Democrats. Whoever is voting Democratic, there's an effort to try to stop those votes.
Exactly. Do any of our panelists want to chime in or add anything to?
No.
Jeff?
I'll say something. Just what June said is, well, it's what she said is excellent. The one nuance that I would add, which really in some ways cuts more against your question, Danny, than what June said, is that it is true that the United States has a very long history of exclusion and racism that goes back to before the American Revolution, and that that Reconstruction was a short-lived and failed project, and that in many ways there's been particularly the exclusion of Black people in the US from the right to vote. That's like, in some ways, that's a consistent trend, but I think there are also some variations within that trend that are important. The Voting Rights Act was the culmination, maybe a flawed culmination, of the civil rights movement in the 60s. And in combination with a lot of other things, the rise of the New Left and other things, it kind of led to a transformation of the Democratic and Republican parties. The Republican Party since 1968 has basically been increasingly a racist party. And so part of the rationale of the voter restriction is out and out racism. Part of it is that it's basically the effort of a party that's increasingly grounded in an aging white constituency to hold on to some influence at a time when the demographics of the country are changing. So in other words, part of what we're seeing now is partly a backlash or reaction to some real changes that have taken place, and which may in fact have some positive implications in the future, should we continue to be a constitutional democracy, which of course is one of the questions that we're now discussing.
Well, Jeff, this leads perfectly to a question that I have been wanting to pose to you, as you know from our email exchanges. How much of what we're talking about here in terms of this overlapping, intersecting cluster of crises and dynamics around the election crisis, how much of this is just the same old, this is a continuation of a process that goes back decades, centuries, in the case of voter suppression? And how much are we talking about something that is very specific to Trumpism? You, Jeff, are a political scientist and specifically a democratic theorist. And I would call you a Trumpologist, although I hope that that's a very short-lived title. I mean, seriously though, you over the last 4 years, you in your public seminar column and in your Facebook posts and your various agitations, you have really been one of the most, I think, forceful diagnosticians of Trumpism and the malevolence of the moment that we are living through. And I'm wondering how much of what we're talking about here are these deep structural, historically rooted dynamics that go back centuries, that have to do with the larger trajectories in American politics, and how much of them are specific? What is specific about this moment in this election crisis that is specifically rooted in the nature of Trump and his presidency?
It's a very difficult question to answer. And it's the kind of question that, like, philosophers of history or political theorists could argue about forever, about the relationship between kind of historical trajectories and more conjunctural dynamics in the present. There are a few things that are obvious. One is that Trumpism as a phenomenon is what we're calling Trumpism has its analogs in many other places, particularly in Europe now, but not just in Europe, in Turkey, arguably
Brazil.
in Russia. So, I mean, clearly in certain parts of Central Europe. And there's been a lot that's written about this. So to the extent that that's true, to the extent that there's a global phenomenon of the rise of a kind of authoritarian right-wing populist leaders that come to power through elections and then use their power to kind of undermine constitutional liberties and undermine democratic processes, that's not unique to the United States. That's obvious. So that's one point. The second point is, I mean, a lot of the problems we're facing now, I think we would face even if Trump had never been elected. Would Black Lives Matter have emerged as it has done in the past year, let's say? We don't know. The issues that Black Lives Matter is bringing to the fore are issues. They've been issues for a very long time. Everything, in some ways, all of the issues that you raised, Danny, which are central to thinking through what's going to happen in the next weeks with this election, having to do with election law, having to do with the decentralization of election administration, et cetera. All of that has to do with incredibly arcane and archaic features of the US Constitution. I mean, deeply rooted. A lot of that has to do with race, but it's not just race, it's a lot of things. So, like, in some ways, the situation we face is very deeply rooted. Even the Republican Party was doing most of the things, that June talked about, all these things, before Trump came along. The book that Michael Waldman wrote, The Fight to Vote, he's the head of the Brennan Center, about these issues, was published in 2016, before Trump was elected. All of these things were taking place in terms of voter suppression. At the same time, I think Trump is kind of like a very perverse, monstrous evolution of republicanism that is so toxic and so dangerous that even lots of Republicans are now recoiling from it. And which is part of the interesting situation we're in, the extent to which there have been so many defections from the Republican Party and from so many places on the political spectrum that were, in fact, behind the Republican Party. There's now some reservation, some defection from Trump. So I do think that Trump has made everything worse. Trump has brought lots of contradictions to the surface. And Trump does wield the executive power of the United States government in terrible ways. I mean, so should he have another 4 years? I do think it would be very terrible in a way that probably wouldn't have been true if Jeb Bush was president, or if Marco Rubio was president, or if Hillary Clinton was president. There would still be a lot of the same problems. We would still have to wrestle with a wide range of issues related to race, related to class, related to gender, related to democratic representation. There might be some other kind of populist leader that would arise. But Trump has really raised the stakes of everything. And he's taken over the Republican Party. Fox News has played an important role in this. Social media has played an important role. I mean, he's completely poisoned the political culture. And so I think
And
No,
activate.
I always like to say it's not just Trump. You know, I think I said this before. You know, Trump is a symptom, and there are right-wing populist authoritarian leaders taking in the ascendancy around the world. And you know, for years and years, you know, the United States was the supposed exporter of democracy, and yet we're seeing the same thing happening everywhere. I'm actually interested to hear from some of our other panelists, like what's driving this and how do we walk it back?
That was
Well, I want to say one other thing first, and maybe June and I disagree about this.
Mhm.
As I said, it's not just Trump, but it's Trump. So I had prostate cancer in 2014. Why? Why did I have prostate cancer? What combination of genetics, diet, like the water I was drinking when I lived on Long Island, what created that? What are the ways that I could reconfigure my life to be healthier? These are all important questions. I also needed to get radiation treatment to end the cancer. And tomorrow is election day. And I completely agree. I've been teaching political science for almost 40 years. It's not Trump. I wrote a book called Democracy in Dark Times in 1998. It was not Trump, but now it's Trump. And there are a whole series of profound issues that need to be addressed in this country after Trump is defeated. Until Trump is defeated, we are in big trouble. And if Trump is not defeated, we are in serious trouble.
Rachel, Maria, I do actually have some questions very specifically for you, but would you like to respond to this particular thread, either of you? Or should I just go ahead and launch into my questions for you?
Maria, do you want to go ahead and I'll follow you?
Yeah, well, I mean, to address the question about the international global context, I mean, yes, there has been a resurgence of authoritarianism globally now for, you know, almost 2 decades. Freedom House, a global watchdog organization, has found that for the past 14 years, there's been a global decline in civil and political freedom scores. The United States has dropped in its democracy ratings, you know, since the last report. So this is a global phenomenon. There are many causes and kind of explanations ranging from increasing inequality to hyper concentration of wealth and power in a smaller number of hands, to rising xenophobia and nationalism, to the feeling of disorientation due to globalization. So there are some meta causes, but I think, and I won't go on about this, but the important point for our conversation too is that this country is not immune to those pressures. And we have been seeing, you know, creeping authoritarianism and backsliding democracy in this country that certainly predates Trump. Absolutely predates Trump, but Trump has certainly been an accelerator, you know, and so all of the signs are there, from the, you know, anti-democratic discourse to the demonization of opponents, to the criminalization of dissent, you know, to, you know, the hollowing out of institutions that are supposed to provide a check on executive power that are now much weaker than they were before. So there's just kind of been a confluence of different factors that makes, you know, our moment right now particularly vulnerable. But this certainly predates this administration.
Absolutely. And I think what this, if we look across the world, what it tells us as well is that there has never been a way of thinking about democratic consolidation. There are many theories that say if you're at a certain number of years and a certain level of income, you know, then you're safe, right? That you're in democracy and you're not going to break down. That is not true. And democracy is never perfected. It has to be continually activated and enacted by all of its constituents. And this moment is a moment of contestation, and we are at the precipice, there is no doubt, but it could be a moment that takes us further into democratic inclusion and expansion, because democracy is so activated, right? We are seeing right now vote turnout rates that we have not seen for over a century. We are seeing people engaging in peaceful protests to demand that violence against Black and brown bodies be stopped by the state coercive forces, right? So we see the claims that citizens are making, and this is a moment in which democracy could go either way, right? And that's why it's such a critical stakes election. I'll say one other thing, which is about the consequences of this election for the global perspective and the global view. And that is that certainly many countries around the world, astute observers, analysts, those in government office know very well that the pressures that America used to be putting in terms of democratic content, political rights, civil liberties, right, anti-corruption, that those are muted right now. They're muted both because they're not being pressed as strongly. They're muted because the American example is so antithetical to those values and principles. So in many conversations that I've had with diplomatic corps representing the United States in Africa, for example, they are telling us how difficult their job is right now, because they don't have a model to look up to, and they don't have necessarily the carrots or the sticks, because that is not where the priority lies in terms of democratic promotion and values. In some ways, the example that America is giving right now is one that is shows the impunity and the kind of corruption that the government, the current president is engaging in. It's also one that shows voter suppression, which we might call in other contexts election rigging, right? That those are the kinds of tactics that a minority party is attempting to put in place to be able to win elections that they do not have the numbers to win, right? So these are strategies that we speak against in other places. And so the result is that a more corrupt world, and the important realization in many countries that they are on their own. But that is not necessarily a bad thing, right? That they also have to determine their own fates, potentially, in terms of thinking about the character of their democratic regimes. And so each country has this kind of path to choose, given these global and structural pressures that Maria was just referring to.
Yeah, really useful. Dan, did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I just had 2 points to build off of the really good comments that Rachel and Maria made. The first is, and also something that June said earlier, I wanted to just talk about, which is related to Trump. And June, you said that you think, Trump says a lot of things that he doesn't necessarily mean. And I think that's right. The issue is that Trump supporters do follow through based on the rhetoric that he espouses, right? And we're seeing that in Texas. And Dana, you highlighted this in your opening comments, and I think it's so important. And it's why in our report, we highlight that the Trump moment is sort of without precedent when you have somebody with the megaphone power and influence that he has, saying the things that he says and tweeting the things that he tweets. It can have, even if it is not him himself employing the state institutions, which, by the way, are not immune. We say in our report that one of the strengths of the US system is that there is an apolitical military, and I think that is largely true and has borne itself out. But by the way, DHS and the Department of Justice under this administration have not maintained their apolitical status and are no longer, to a large extent, trusted actors by a large segment of the population, right? And that will matter in a contestation scenario or in a scenario where there's violent incidents. And in the past, you might have seen, DHS or others be deployed, their police forces be deployed to take action to prevent violence or to subdue violence. They are now in some ways, an untrusted actor themselves. On the stage, right? And so it's really, I think, important to mention that. And then one other point on the sort of implications for global standing and status of the United States. I mean, look, I think that we have to be honest and confront the fundamental fact that the U.S. has already taken tremendous amount of damage to its international standing and credibility and its ability. I've seen a number of comments come through the chat about the ability of the United States to do democracy promotion and other things overseas. I think a lot of credibility has been spent and a lot of damage done, and rebuilding that is very, very hard to do. So I don't think we should expect, even in a scenario where there is a transition in power and a President Biden becomes, that the United States suddenly regains its ability to do broad-scale democracy promotion. I think the people who do that work are very good at it, but are going to have to get creative and think through how to do this kind of work. But it'll also have an implication beyond that. The United States, something I've worked a lot on in my career, is a sort of counterterrorism programming training that gets done overseas. And there is messaging and all kinds of training built into that about respect for the rule of law and the importance of not doing extrajudicial killings and all kinds of things about how police forces, interior ministries, militaries are supposed to conduct themselves. And frankly, some of these kinds of issues are those kinds of messages are now even more diluted than would have been in the past. And again, it's not that the United States would have been the sole actor who had the ability to speak from the sort of shining city on the hill example in the past, but that image, that standing, I just think has been degraded significantly in the last 4 years. And I think as we sort of start to think about whatever happens, whether it's a second Trump term or a Biden administration, I think we have to start thinking as a country. And this is also where Congress's role will matter a lot. And Congress will have to think seriously about how it tries to do oversight of administration actions and programming, to be honest about what's achievable and what's realistic, right, in this current moment.
Yeah, that's excellent. Now, let me just, as a point of order, let me remind people to type your questions, because we want to bring the audience in very soon. Type your questions in the chat. Lorena Neal, our colleague at the Evanston Public Library, is assembling and getting your questions together to present them to the panelists. But before we do that, I want to drill a little bit with Rachel and Maria. To the two of you, really, and for everybody, but particularly the two of you, there's a substantial body of political science scholarship on electoral violence in various countries around the world. And I'm wondering if the two of you can share some of the insights or lessons in that scholarship that might help us make sense of the current situation with our election here. And very specifically, Rachel, you're an authority on the politics of elections in Africa. What parallels or lessons do you see between some of the African cases that you've studied and our current situation in the US? And Maria, you've written extensively on authoritarianism, but you've also written the book on civil resistance movements against dictators and autocrats. And you've looked very specifically at tactics. What kinds of tactics are most effective? And the key question of violence versus nonviolence. What lessons are there in these two spheres of your research, Maria? On the one hand, authoritarianism, and on the other hand, civil resistance, that to our present moment. Whichever of the two of you would like to go first.
Just jump in to address that question of what the African context tells us specifically. And one thing that I think is very clear in observing elections from Egypt to Kenya to Malawi to Benin, Liberia, when you see that the incumbent party or the dominant party stays in power by tilting the playing field so dramatically that the majority's will cannot be represented, then the only recourse for the opposition is to move to non-electoral processes, right? So this is the case, for example, after the Muslim Brotherhood was kicked out in Egypt. This is the case, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, as we just saw in the election this Saturday, that the opposition candidates were barred from running, right? So when the opposition has no significant chance of translating their popular support into elected office, then the routes become not about elections, but about contestation, right? And so the means through which that's enacted can be violent, it can be peaceful protest, it can be resorting to a kind of exit, right? Like trying to disconnect from the state and the ruling party. So there are ways in which the lack of trust in the system, the lack of legitimacy of the system means that actors will opt out, and that creates a security threat in and of itself, right? So we see that with the rise of non-state actors because they don't feel connected to the political process that represents them.
Perfect segue for Maria, given your expertise on violence versus non-violence in tactics.
Yeah, no, you know, one thing we know about autocrats and would-be autocrats around the world is that they always want you to believe that they call the shots and that they have all the power and that people are kind of helpless in the face, you know, of the system, if you will. And so what we know from so many popular struggles against authoritarianism around the world is that all autocrats have an Achilles heel. And their Achilles heel is that they ultimately depend on the compliance and cooperation of ordinary people to stay in power. So they depend on workers, they depend on bureaucrats, they depend on professionals, they depend on taxpayers, they depend on all of these so-called pillars of support or organizations and institutions that provide them with power. And if and when people who make up those institutions, police, bureaucrats, workers, unions, media folks, when they stop obeying and stop cooperating with the power holder, they no longer can stay in power. And so, you know, in the movements for democracy that I've studied around the world, and one of the kind of key reasons why these movements have historically been so successful against autocrats and would-be autocrats is that they're able to engage in mass mobilization. So we know, for example, that movements that tend to succeed, including in cases where there are attempts to steal the election. So think Serbia in the year 2000, when Slobodan Milosevic attempted to steal the election. Think Ukraine 2004-5, when Yanukovych attempted to steal the election. Think most recently in the Gambia, when President Jammeh attempted to go against the popular will. So in all these cases where there were popular protests and mobilizations, you know, after the attempt to steal the election, they succeeded. And the reason they succeeded is that these movements were, number one, able to attract mass, diverse participation. So the goal is to win over the middle and to bring lots of different people into the movement. So it's to kind of, appeal to people who would normally not identify as activists and invite them to join the struggle for democracy. So mass diverse participation that involves key people from those pillars of support that I mentioned. The second thing we know is that the ability to maintain nonviolent discipline in the face of violence, which is sadly almost always perpetrated by state actors and paramilitary groups, but being able to maintain discipline in order to maintain high levels of participation and to make the violent repression used by state and paramilitary forces backfire against them, causing them to lose support. That is really critically important. And we know, for example, that women's active participation in movements tends to contribute to overall nonviolent discipline, which contributes to success. We also know about the important role that faith leaders play in maintaining calm and maintaining discipline in the face of violence and repression. We also know, third, that movements that are able to diversify their tactics and use a broad repertoire of different nonviolent actions that go well beyond street protests and demonstrations, which are one of hundreds of different nonviolent tactics available to ordinary people, that the ability to use and expand the repertoire of nonviolent actions is really critical to success. And I think this is going to be especially critical in our moment, where, again, in the event of, clear attempts to subvert the election, people are going to understandably take to the streets, and they're going to protest and they're going to demonstrate. And that can be incredibly powerful. At the same time, what we know from movements around the world in places like Serbia, Ukraine, Gambia, is that being able to move from street protests to mass non-cooperation, so think strikes, boycotts, stay-at-homes, go slow, all of these kind of dispersed acts of non-cooperation can be incredibly powerful in applying social, political, and economic pressure to, in our case, ensure that all votes are counted and that the winner is chosen by voters. So, those kind of three key things of mass diverse participation, nonviolent discipline and the use of different tactics and moving from protest to non-cooperation, I think are going to be particularly relevant in our context.
Powerful. Dan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just had two quick points building off of something that Rachel said when she talked about state exit. I couldn't help but think of militias, and particularly like the Oath Keepers and some of the others that are maybe less tied to a right-wing ideology and more tied to sort of suspicion and a lack of trust in the state. I think those groups have incredibly wide memberships, right? I don't want to discount the potential impact of the right-wing extremist groups like the Proud Boys and others. But I do think there is a separate set of militia groups that's important to sort of account for. The other thing that there's a story that I want to point out that I think is particularly interesting that points out one of these sort of inherent contradictions that Rachel, I think, was hinting at a little bit. There was an NPR story that was done on the potential for sort of violence, the same sort of discussion that we're having now, where they interviewed a man in Wisconsin who was both a county commissioner and the leader of a private militia. And so there is also an inherent sense of people who are a part of the system, but don't like the way that the system is evolving or changing. As I talked about in our report, we talk about the sort of social political moment that we're in here in the United States, right? And so it's also, I think, important to incumbent to point out in terms of that context of state exit, folks who are currently a part of the system, right, but don't have the power to sort of shape or change or adapt it, right? And so may take power through armed force, right? I'm not suggesting this particular individual is specifically going to do that, but it is a theme that I think you can draw out. I mean, and again, this is like the subject of another very interesting report for anyone who's listening who wants to do it, who can do the field work, to go and talk to people who are in these kinds of places, right? Who are thinking about this kind of state exit context. I actually think that kind of, I mean, I know that COVID makes that kind of field work very hard to do, but it's incredibly important. And this is, again, one of the things we pride ourselves on at Crisis Group is to do this kind of detailed research where we try to talk to all sides. And we did have somebody who went out and did some of these interviews with some of these groups that are reflected in the report, but to really treat it in a very deep way, I think is going to be important.
You might want to have an offline conversation with June Cross about that, since she directs the documentary media program at the Columbia Journalism School and has that toolkit. If you've seen her film, Whose Vote Counts, it deploys exactly this kind of storytelling, this approach to storytelling in a very textured way. Jeff, you want to chime in?
I want to ask a question of Rachel, Maria, and Daniel. How do you assess the distinctive fact that central to the U.S. Constitution is the Second Amendment, and there are millions of guns just legally circulating, and there's a National Rifle Association? How does that create a violent potentiality or complexity of violence that may differ from some of the situations that you've studied, where it's pretty much people nonviolently against the state? But as Daniel pointed out, we have a situation here where there are paramilitary forces and just armed people that aren't part of the state necessarily, but can play a very important role in precipitating a crisis. How do you see that playing out?
I mean, I would just say there's actually precursors in our history. During the civil rights movement, Black activists were facing state violence and also KKK terrorists. So, like, you know, they have taught, you know, us as scholars of civil resistance and activists around the world quite a lot about how you can engage in, you know, protest and civil resistance in the face of paramilitary groups and domestic terrorist groups. So I think, you know, one thing, and this is definitely part of trainings that are happening right now in the country on the potential need for nonviolent mass action if the elections are stolen, is that, you know, you want to focus on actions that are going to bring, you know, that are less likely to bring harm to protesters. And that's why it's important to emphasize that there is a broad array of different tactics. So for example, if, you know, it's clear that far right groups are going to be mobilizing, marching, protesting in a certain area, groups can choose to avoid them. They can choose choose to engage in actions in different locations. They can have, organized stay-at-home symbolic banging pots and pans on the balconies kind of thing. And then, I think also important is just to recognize that in this case, it will probably take tactics other than street engagements and confrontations to be effective and to be powerful. And this is why the conversation about non-cooperation and about strikes and boycotts is especially important. But anyway, and there are definitely tactically things that groups have done historically, other places around the world to prevent paramilitary infiltration, to warn people when there are agents provocateurs, people who are specifically going to protests and groups to foment violence. So there are things tactically that groups can do to prepare for these, but one is just to do what the opponent, in this case paramilitary groups, don't expect you to do, and not engage in actions that they may be wanting you to engage in.
Just add on to that. Oh, go ahead, June.
No, I was just going to say, I'm trying to remember, was it in a report, Maria, that you did, or somewhere in the last week, I've read that there actually have been discussions at the AFL-CIO level about strikes. Was that your report, or was that somewhere that I read it? I'm beginning to lose track of where I'm seeing things. I'm reading too much, but I think there have been discussions around these questions and how they're going to, what happens if they're, and all of this is like, if one side or the other wins decisively, I think, then we call it a day, but if we're going to fight over the margins, there will be fights around the margins. And the question is what form they will take. I'm sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
So actually, in many of the contexts where I work, there can be armed groups that actively contest election results and actively contest the central power, particularly in separatist regions or other zones that do not feel included by the center. So that is absolutely the context that I'm drawing from, and that's precisely why I think that the role of the military and the police in terms of whether or not they uphold our civil liberties and political rights to protest peacefully or to occupy space and protect those protesting citizens against those that would do them harm. That perhaps in some ways that's a naive view when we see the history of police. But when we looked at this summer, federal agents going into Portland and Chicago, and the ways in which those
to request an app
to the political rights and people mobilizing and protesting, I think that is a key example, and it doesn't set a good precedent the way in which that came down.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. If there are mass protests and Trump declares a state of emergency or invokes the Insurrection Act, and we see Portland multiplied across the country, that is a scenario that has been on a lot of people's minds, and that Trump himself has suggested in very enthusiastically. I think it's time to bring the audience in. Lorena, how would you like to take the stage and start presenting some of the questions? I've seen a lot of activity in the chat box, which is very exciting. Are you still with us? There we go.
I am still here. And yeah, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. And we have had a very active chat. So I'm going to try and get some of the questions out in something resembling reasonable order, and try and hit some of the main points here for you. I think the kind of the starting point is, if you think if either Biden or Trump manages to win definitively with no controversy about the outcome, a concession speech, the whole deal, do you still expect post-election violence? Do you expect it no matter what? Is it inevitable, or do you think it can be avoided at this point?
Who might want to respond to that? I mean, Dan, you authored a report on the threat of electoral violence. Whoever wants to respond to that.
May I start, Danny, on that?
Please. Please.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the things we've been talking about here, and I think the other panelists have all done a very good job of sort of attacking a certain piece of this. And as much as I said in my opening remarks that I don't think violence is inevitable, I do think that there has been such a delegitimization of the process writ large through rhetoric, particularly by the president, but not just by the president, by a number of folks, that it is hard for me to imagine that even in a wipeout scenario that there is no violence, period, right? There is going to be some subset of the population that I think will be dissatisfied with the result and will register that dissatisfaction. I think the question is as to what extent, right? Does that mean that there are violent protests? Does it mean people take their guns and march? Does it mean that they do what they did in June in Michigan and show up at the State House and try to visibly harass legislators and shut down the legislative session, right? So there's a wide spectrum of actions that can be taken, right? And that we might define as violent, right? That don't necessarily mean loss of life or otherwise, right? And so I think that sort of, to me, I think the answer is there is going to be some level of unrest. The question of whether that, maybe unrest is the right word, right? I think maybe that's where I would draw the distinction. I think there will be unrest because of how much distrust in the process has been fomented, but I don't necessarily know that it rises to the level of violence. Let me put it that way. I don't know, Maria and Rachel will probably have things that are more precise on terminology than what I'm saying, but I do think there's an important distinction to be drawn there.
No need to respond, other panelists. If there are so many other questions, we can move on to the next question, only if you have something specifically you wanted to add to that. Otherwise, we can move on to the next question.
I mean, I would just say that unrest, like everything tends to get caught up in unrest. So for example, protest, even disciplined, organized protests, sometimes the coverage of those can be, this is, civil unrest and the like. And unrest, the connotation is generally negative. And so sometimes inadvertently, when we put everything together as civil unrest, then it can, delegitimize or, give a negative impression of what is otherwise very positive citizen behavior that is integral to our democracy. So I think, and this is so important when we look at things, to be able to know what to call them. And when violence, if and when it breaks out in a protest, to not be ambiguous about the language around protest and make it seem like it's two-sided, when in many cases it's not. And protesters tend to be on the receiving end of violence more so than being the perpetrators of violence. So you have to be clear and unambiguous in how to characterize and classify these events.
I would just add to that very quickly, and this gets back to our earlier question about what's distinctive about Trumpism versus these larger historical sort of forces. If you've read the anthropologist William Mossarella's study of Trump followers, which is incredibly insightful and disturbing, he points out that the emotional connection that many Trump followers have with Trump is rather unlike anything we've seen in American politics in a very long time, if ever. The intensity, the depth, the emotional attachment to the leader is very, very powerful. And you combine that with the culture of conspiracism, which is part and parcel of the Trump phenomenon, of the Trump cult and the media disinformation environment. And what you get is a lot of people, we don't know how many, it's certainly not all Trump supporters. It might not even be a majority, but there's a critical mass of Trump supporters who believe very deeply that Trump must be the president, and that if he, quote unquote, loses, it would by definition only be as a result of some sort of theft, some sort of malfeasance. It couldn't possibly be that he would lose legitimately. This is, again, it could be a minoritarian view even within Trump supporters, but these people are disproportionately likely to be armed, to be prepared to act on these beliefs. And so I would not discount the emotional dimension of Trumpism and the Trump the force of emotions in Trump's supporters. Lorena, do we want to
All
move
right.
on to the next? Jeff
I was
Isaac.
gonna, yeah,
Sorry,
Jeff,
Jeff
did you have,
Jeff,
did you have
want
something to add? Yeah, I'm sorry, you're muted, Jeff.
Oh, Jeff, you have to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, I want to just follow up on what Maria said, because she has consistently made these incredibly important arguments about the importance of nonviolence and also the importance of naming violence. And your account of the range of the repertoire of nonviolent strategies and tactics before was really important. Will Weinkoff posted something about protect the results, and you've written about that. There are a number of organizations that are holding the line, that are pursuing these things right now. I guess I just want to say one other thing, which is that I totally agree with you about the importance of leadership and a certain kind of self-limitation. You talked about faith leaders. You talked about the importance of not showing up where the right-wing paramilitaries are going to be. I agree with you completely. But we know that everyone on the left doesn't agree with you about that. And I fear that. It doesn't have to be a lot of people. It could be a small people. In Portland, there are people who don't agree with that nonviolence, or who really believe it's important to be in the face of the fascists. And then there's the danger of conflagration. So it's not only on the right that there is a danger of setting off the spark. I think that it's also on the left, and I'm not saying it's equivalent at all, morally or politically or in terms of numbers, but I do fear that. All it takes is a couple of provocateurs to get a situation going that the right wing would just love to step into, and Trump would love to step into, and most police departments would love to step into. And that I fear that.
Right, so I think this kind of leads into our next sort of series of questions. I did have an alternate wardrobe choice from tonight. I decided, in the interest of professionalism, maybe not to wear this. But I think this is where a lot of us are. I think most of us have checked these two items off our to-do list currently, but a lot of the questions in the chat, and Maria and Daniel and Rachel, you've all kind of addressed this to some degree. People are looking for what they can do individually, the organizations to connect with. And Maria, you posted a nice list in the chat, and I want to draw everyone's attention to that. She did post several organizations there that I would urge you, those of you who are looking for direction or groups to connect with, to look at her list there. We also had, kind of relating to that, a question from Lauren about with mass collective action, including diverse actors that are successful in the ways you're describing, in a two-party presidential winner-takes-all kind of system like we have, is this harder to achieve? Are there too few coalitions to really work together? Are we too divided too evenly?
Rachel, you can start.
Sure. Great question, Lauren. Thanks for that. And I would just build upon that to say, I think that the partisan nature of the American electoral system is absolutely fueling this kind of polarization and the kind of identification with Trump that Danny was just mentioning. But one element that we can't forget is the role of enabling elites. And I think that the way in which the Republican Party, it certainly is not just Trump, right? Trump being Trump and doing his thing. He is enabled by a set of party elites who are doing his business in the Senate and are doing it quickly to maintain power that is based on a minority of voters, right? And that is, in fact, their strategy right now. So I would say it's even less about the kind of the system of two-partyism right now in the United States and the way in which the system is trying to be subverted by those who currently occupy institutions to do so. And I think that's what's extremely troubling. But I think building upon that, and this relates to the most recent question in the chat, as well, I think by Ed Lockwood about, should Biden, if elected and, able to take office, should he, invoke a kind of massive reform, a court packing, and the like. the first order of business for the Biden administration, should they take power and assume the presidency in January, would be to redress, to attempt to re-establish the legitimacy and trust in our democratic system, and to be able to move forward in gaining people's confidence in how the political system can address their needs at the basic level in terms of then, public health, economic concerns, right? The whole list of rights and inclusion, right, that we can address. But the first act has to be to bring people back in.
Dan, did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I just had something that I wanted to add to Rachel's very good comments, which is that, in particular in the Senate, you have seen the Senate Majority Leader make quite expressly clear that his priority has been getting federal judges confirmed to the bench. Leaving aside the politics of the Supreme Court nomination and pushing that through while not addressing a COVID relief package in the Senate, which has its own dynamic unto itself, there has been a concerted strategy to get judges confirmed as quickly as possible, right? Because there is an understanding by him and others that putting in place folks with like political views on the federal bench who have lifetime appointments is a way of enshrining a worldview that permeates itself throughout sort of how laws are applied across the board, right? And so this is something that is serious and is going to be an issue that has to be confronted at some point if there is a Biden administration, and frankly, even if there isn't a Biden administration, right? The other point I want to make is also more broadly about the trust and faith that Americans have in the institution of Congress, right? It's not as if over the last 4 years, the faith that the American people have in Congress to check the behavior of the administration has increased, right? And even when Congress has been able to come together on a somewhat bipartisan basis around the application of congressional war powers in the Yemen context, the president simply vetoed the act that was sent to his desk, and there were no consequences for that in Congress. It's not as if you saw a bipartisan coalition of members step up with a veto-proof majority to suspend arms sales to the Saudi coalition, for instance, right? So even in the foreign policy context, leaving aside the domestic policy context, you have seen that the president has had pretty broad acquiescence to his agenda, and it has, I think, lessened the hand that Congress has to play vis-a-vis the president's actions on seizing congressional power across the board, whether it's on war powers, arms sales, or otherwise.
I think it's important also to look beyond this election and beyond Trump. This is a census year, and the census has been short-circuited, but the state legislators that are elected tomorrow are going to be the ones that are redrawing districts and setting the policy and the politics for the next 10 years. And I think we haven't really, everybody's so focused on Trump or Biden that we've lost sight. It is a really, really important election for determining what the next 10 years are going to be like. And I think Mitch McConnell's actions in the Senate have really been aimed at maintaining a Republican hegemony. And to the degree that I've read some of the CEOs of the Fortune 500 are by and large not behind Trump. And you have the Lincoln Project, which is a whole other group of people who are, former Republicans. I guess he would call them Republicans in name only. But then, lawyers like Ben Ginsberg, who brought us George Bush and Bush v. Gore in 2000. There's a whole core of Republicans who have decided that this is sort of a morally bankrupt presidency, and they need to at least move away from that. But in all of the focus on the presidency, we need to remember that there are, I think, something like 80% of the state legislature, 80% of the incumbents in state legislatures are going to be elected tomorrow. It is it's sort of like it's one of those weird things, the way the map has worked out. So there's a huge number of states that are going to turn over or not tomorrow. And right now, Republicans run something like 39 of the 50 states at the state legislature. In other words, they have both a Republican state Senate and a Republican assembly. So, you know, there's a lot of things to be thinking about at a more granular level than what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Sure. And thank you for that. And I think that kind of segues into sort of our next question, which has been raised by a number of people, including Jeff Goldfarb, but sort of the audience in general, which is how much can we rely on and use our institutions, our institutional powers, if the election results are contested or unclear? And then with the amount of legislation that is going on with all the court appointments recently and over the past few years, it's been mentioned that there are already 400 different cases currently in the courts related to the election at this point before the results are even in. How does this compare to a normal election year? How do you think the various parties are prepared to handle this? How do you think the courts are prepared to handle this? And to what extent can we have faith in that system and use that system?
That's a huge question, is there? I don't know where to start.
I only ask the easy ones.
I wouldn't even know where to start. I'm going to defer.
I'll say something.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I don't think it's a normal election in any way. I think the courts could conceivably be overwhelmed by litigation about this election. And Trump's way of being, I mean, what June said is true. Up and down the ballot, the election is absolutely crucial in just so many ways. And we are mainly talking about Trump. Maybe there are good reasons for that, but it's not just about Trump. But a lot of this litigation is going to be about the presidential election. And I think I don't know, I don't have a great deal of faith. I mean, I think even if you assume that the people running our courts are trying to do the best they can, these are really knotty problems. And, you know, when you have people that really want to make trouble, they can make trouble. Trump did this in private business. He sued everybody. He forced everyone to sue him. You know, you could just really throw kind of a monkey wrench into the system if you want. And I am concerned about that. The Democratic Party is now, for all its limits and its problems and its weaknesses and its blindnesses, is the institution, the key institution of the future, up and down the ballot. That's the only answer to Jeff Goldfarb's question that I have.
I mean, I would just add, I think institutions are, you know, the foundation of our electoral process and of our democracy. At the same time, we know that institutions are imperfect, and there are times when it takes the will of the people to decide and organize citizen action. And so that's where it's not either or. And when you think about it, this is not a case of, is it the institutions or is it protesters and people? It's both. And sometimes citizen action, protests, civil resistance is needed to uphold the integrity of institutions and to advance rule of law when otherwise, rule of law is being undermined, i.e. an attempt to subvert the election. So, and there's plenty of research out there, by the way, that in fact, perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, nonviolent action, protest, civil resistance contributes to stronger democratic institutions. And so I think this is just important to bear in mind that we may be in a situation where, people are not going to be satisfied with the outcome of this election being decided by the Supreme Court. And it should be the voters who decide. It should be the will of the people that decides the election. And I think the American people are going to need to insist on that and organize around that and make sure that the will of the people prevails.
I completely agree with that, Maria. And I think, that returns back to the point of institutions themselves. The content of what they provide is something that's continually contested, right? And the institutions like the Electoral College are legacies of an authoritarian beginning, right? And that is the case in so many countries, the ways in which the institutions that are put in place at an earlier period are meant to uphold the power of those who put those institutions in place. And we see that continually today. And then the fights that we're fighting right now, the contestation that this moment represents, is a way of activating those institutions into different directions, potentially for reform, and to potentially be more inclusive and more directly translate the will of the people into elected office. And so that is why it's absolutely so critical that the citizens don't necessarily rely upon the Supreme Court and those processes, and work to shape those outcomes as they're being deliberated.
If I could just come in on this, Danny, I want to take a related but different tack to the answer that the other panelists have given here, which is that you said this in your opening, but I think it bears repeating that International Crisis Group has been in existence for 25 years and really has exclusively looked at conflicts all over the world, right? And us taking the step of looking at the potential for election violence and instability in the United States is really, frankly, unprecedented for us. And I would say, you know, we're in a unique moment. Can you trust institutions to an extent? I think the points that Maria made are entirely valid about the importance of citizen action, and I'm very happy to be able to foot stomp them and support them. It's as if I think for us, the moment that was there were two crystallizing moments, at least for me personally, in this moment that we're finding ourselves in. The first was what happened in Lafayette Square around the BLM protests and the employment of state resources against nonviolent protesters who were protesting peacefully. And then it was the Transition Integrity Project and the work that Rosa Brooks did in the Washington Post article, and all the different results that I thought, at least for me, helped bring together a number of strands that I had been thinking about, right? And those are two moments in time, but that I think indicate to me the sort of unprecedented nature of the space that we find ourselves in. And I guess if I'm being asked to answer the specific question of can you trust the institutions, I think there are parts of it and ways in which it can be trusted, but that trust shouldn't be absolute. And what Maria said absolutely stands.
I'm glad you mentioned Lafayette Square and that moment, because I think we might be thinking a lot more about that in the coming days. Lorena, do you present the next question?
Sure thing. We had one early on that I wanted to circle back to, which was about in transitional situations, for example, Spain or Brazil at the end of their dictatorships, some nonpartisan voices rose up to urge patience and respect for the process from everyone involved. And in the case that Trump claims victory tomorrow night, though many votes are still being counted, whose voice could come forward to state clearly and assertively, wait and let all votes count, and be seen as nonpartisan enough to be respected? Do we have any figures left in this country, regardless of who declares victory, who have that kind of standing to encourage everybody to wait for the full process to play out?
Does anyone?
And here I would like to, I will just post in the chat, Leslie Odom Jr. has a lovely PSA out on Twitter reprising his role from Hamilton in Wait for It, which definitely is a lovely message, but I don't know that he qualifies as nonpartisan enough to persuade the whole nation to wait for it.
Interestingly, when we look at, again, comparative examples, in many of the democratic transition points from authoritarian single-party military rule to multi-party democratic elections in Africa in the early 1990s, key figures that oversaw those transitions and helped to move from point A to point B were often religious leaders. So if we think even about the role of bishops, cardinals, in these critical moments, they were often able to preside over a kind of general public. But I think that is so far from the case in the United States, because many religious bodies have been such politically motivated actors and had a political agenda. So that seems to kind of take many of those off the table in our context.
I mean, I think it's going to take everyone. It's going to take, you know, bipartisan leaders. So, for example, a bipartisan task force on election integrity has issued a statement calling for, you know, calling for every vote to be counted and the results to reflect the will of voters. So I think that it's helpful to still hear nonpartisan statements from officials and former officials. At the same time, I think it actually will take entertainers, artists, and athletes. Athletes in particular, look how much, you know, LeBron James and beyond have emphasized, you know, voting and getting people out to vote and challenging voter suppression. So, I mean, I think it really is going to take that constituency to insist that the will of the people be respected. I think it's going to take business leaders and, you know, Leadership Now and Civic Alliance and a couple others have helped to mobilize businesses to come out publicly and to pledge publicly to, you know, ensure that all votes are counted. And, you know, the business community may be called upon to participate in non-cooperation and to wield economic pressure in the event that there are attempts to steal the election. So I think from the business community and of course the religious, the interfaith community, prominent religious leaders, and, you know, it would be wonderful if more evangelical leaders came out and, you know, insisted that, you know, that democracy be defended, that it goes way beyond any political, you know, candidates. It's about this country. So I think, you know, religious leaders across the faith spectrum from different, you know, kind of communities is so important. So already like entertainers, business, interfaith groups, and youth. So you may all be tracking that a national youth coalition has started to organize and say that, you know, we will launch a nationwide strike in the event that red lines are crossed and there's an attempt to steal the election. So youth are like often in the avant-garde of pro-democracy movements, and I expect no different here in the US.
Do you think that businesses, we have a question that recently popped up in the chat about, you know, the possibilities of Wall Street and Silicon Valley joining in sort of in their economic interests, as well as some of maybe the big blue states like California and New York, using their economic power in the event of things going in Trump's direction, where it's not considered a legitimate result. Do you think that's a possible coalition that could work? Do you think they would be willing to do that kind of work?
Yes. I think if the situation really devolves and the outcome is uncertain, I think Maria, Daniel, and Rachel all kind of indicating this, different civil society agents are going to come forward if there's going to be a resolution. And I'm certain that, I mean, if the economy tanks, Wall Street people are going to say, you know, this can't go on because of their own interests. So I do think that those types of dynamics will come into play. Someone asked about former presidents. I know for a fact that a lot of Lincoln Project people and Republican voters against Trump have been trying to persuade George W. Bush to come out, and he obviously hasn't said anything. I think it's possible he might say something like, if Trump loses and refuses to go away, those sorts of things could matter. Obviously, they don't solve any political problem moving forward, but they may solve that particular problem of resolving the crisis and aiding a peaceful transition, a peaceful transfer of power.
What does the panel think about the Lincoln Project and, you know, whether it's had a significant impact on the electoral process so far? And what do you think about working, you know, say Biden does win, what do you think about working with them going forward? Do you think that their actions or intentions are in line with a future Biden administration? Do you think that a Democratic administration should work towards sort of a combined moderate centrist bloc, or would you prefer to see it go in a, sort of truth and reconciliation, get everything out, send everyone to jail direction?
I'll take the first one of those questions and leave the other ones to the rest of the panel. I was interviewing someone today who spends a great deal of time looking at disinformation efforts. And they said the hottest subject today was an effort by the Russians pretending to be a militia, speaking for a militia, and saying that they were upset with Trump because he was not enough of a white supremacist, and expressing a fear that in his second term he would turn into a regular conservative Republican. So I take that as a signal that somebody is concerned that the sort of conservative wing of the George Bush wing, I guess, of the Republican Party is concerned that in fact their defection is making a dent. I know Benjamin Ginsburg, who is the dean of Republican lawyers, has been writing pretty much weekly, if not twice a week, on the fact that fraud is not a serious problem as it's being presented. Against the fact that this president is trying to undermine the credibility of the entire election. I think those are signs that mainstream, what we used to think of as mainstream Republicans, are not happy with the direction of the party. On the other hand, we have Mitch McConnell. So, I don't know what to do with truth and reconciliation versus any other thing. I'll leave that to the other experts on the panel.
I've been writing about the Lincoln Project since it emerged. I think that it ought to be welcomed as an ally in the defense of liberal democracy. Some of those people probably want to be part of a centrist move within the Democratic Party. Some of them, I think, would like to reclaim the Republican Party. I'm following off what Rachel said before. I think in the immediate aftermath of a transition, if there is one, Biden needs to promote some healing. But I think that ultimately the Democratic Party now we're talking politics, needs to move forward as what it is and in response to its core constituencies. And that means not, asking Republicans to run the Department of Labor or the Department of Transportation or the Treasury Department. I would be against that.
Jeff, on that point, as you know, VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy think tank in Sweden, recently issued a report, a study mapping the metamorphosis of the Republican Party and over the last 30 years and comparing it now at this stage of the game to Viktor Orban's party in Hungary and to other authoritarian parties around the world that have, that are playing by the rules of democracy up to a point to get elected and even win re-election in some cases, but that have thoroughly threaten the norms of democratic institutions and invoke authoritarian, the politics of enemy construction and repression and so forth. And I'm wondering if you think that anyone on the panel, does anyone think that this, what this portends, this devolution of the Republican Party, what this portends for a post-Trump GOP?
It's bad.
Is the genie out of the bottle though? Can they just sweep it, can they go back in time and, or how deep is the damage?
I think it's done. I see where Jeff and I are shaking our heads. Yeah. Now that the damage is done, the genie is out of the bottle. We're going to have to rebuild a lot of institutions. And the debate that's going on within the American public is not going to go away. I mean, just even in the chats over how do we define violence. I mean, the tragedies that are occurring on a daily basis in this country are not going to be undone regardless of who wins, but it's going to be the responsibility of whoever wins to try to figure out what to do about it.
I agree completely with June, and I think we also have the thing we haven't talked about tonight is the role of social media in polarization and in driving a narrative and driving us further apart. And that tool fundamentally is so deeply embedded in our society as a whole that even if there is a post-Trump moment that's coming soon, the tool that manipulates people and drives them to extremes is still going to exist. And how we reckon with that, I have no idea. It's an incredibly complicated question, but it is one that will have to be reckoned with in this context for sure.
You know, because
And I would, if I could, I'd like to pose that question to anyone else on the panel. You know, so there was a Pew report that came out in September that found that basically 80% of both Trump and Biden supporters said they had few or no friends who supported the other candidate. We are so completely divided. I'm going to post in the chat also a Reuters article that came out, I think, today about, you know, families divided, divorces, parents and children not speaking, siblings not speaking, old friendships fractured. Yeah, how do we come to a personal, on a very micro level, personal reconciliation with each other, regardless of whatever the results are tomorrow?
I don't think there is, regardless of the results tomorrow. I think in other words, I think if Trump wins, there's not going to be many people who oppose him wanting to talk to Trump supporters. I don't. I think if Biden wins, there are policies that can maybe bring a lot of people along, but it'll take time. Trump can win. This entire conversation has been centered around the question of, like, what if he tries to steal the election? He can win the election. I mean, he won't win the popular vote, but the popular vote doesn't decide the election. That's what's really scary. And this goes to a lot of the points that June was making about how deep the rot of our political system is. I mean, he could literally win the election. And then all of us who are feared that he are afraid that he will steal it will have to say, well, he won fair. He won a terrible process fairly at the margins. What does that say for our society? Because he's an autocrat. That means that the electoral process, properly conceived, supported 4 more years of an autocrat.
I think we also won't know tomorrow, so I think we need to let go of that idea.
I agree with you.
Anything tomorrow. At the most, it's going to, I think on the good side, it's going to be till Friday, till we have a really good sense, and probably into next week. Because there's so many absentee ballots. I mean, I did a panel earlier today in Wisconsin, and they've had 600,000 people vote early and 2 million absentee ballots, which is it's totally reverse. And I asked, how long is it going to take them to count 2 million absentee ballots? And they say, well, by law, we're supposed to have them all counted by Wednesday at 3 p.m., but nobody knows what's going to happen if we can't get them all counted by then.
Yeah, I have one other point to make just right on top of what June said. I heard Rachel Kleinfeld, who's at the Carnegie Institute, who's really excellent on these issues, speaking on this recently. And what she said is that because of all of the different legislative and judicial and rules around elections in this country and the way in which they're administered and the levels at which they're administered, you're really talking about actually something like 13,000 different elections that are happening in the United States, right? Because they're not set in federal law. They're not all done the same way. So it's a long-winded way of saying June's right. We're not going to know tomorrow. It's going to take time.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. I want to just say this, it is now 8 o'clock in Chicago and 9 o'clock where all 5 of our panelists are located. This has been a very East Coast centric panel in that sense, but I want to, it is inspiring to me that we had about 100 people Zoom in for this and almost all of them stayed on for 2 full hours. That says a lot about people's engagement and also about how compelling our 5 panelists and their analyses and insights have been. So I want to thank Jeff Isaac, Dan Schneiderman, Rachel Beatty Riedl, Maria Stefan, and June Cross for joining us this evening and sharing their insights on these critical questions. I want to thank Lorena Neal of the Evanston Public Library and the library itself for partnering with our Center for International and Comparative Studies at Northwestern. And I want to thank everyone who zoomed in for this conversation, which this is an intense moment. There are a lot of other things that people could have been doing tonight. The chat, by the way, has been really vibrant. It'll be interesting to see the transcript of it. And please do follow the Center for International and Area Studies on Facebook and Twitter. I posted the links earlier, but in case you didn't see that in this very fleeting scroll, I'm going to post it one more time here to everyone. And why don't we all just give our panelists a round of virtual or Zoom applause for their really great, for the time and their insights tonight. Thanks to everyone for zooming in, and let's see what happens.
Thanks to Danny Postel.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you to all of you.
Yes.
We appreciate all of the panelists this evening and everyone who contributed to the thoughtful conversation. So thank you all very much.
It was great to meet you all, and I'm following everybody on Twitter.
Oh, fabulous.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Be
Cheers.
safe.
Thanks, everyone.
There's also COVID. Be careful.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, that.
Yeah, all right.
that little thing.
Stay alive.